Hanging with Higgins, where author and former prosecutor John J. Higgins interviews his intriguing guests about their lives, knowledge, experiences, and projects. Explore, learn, and be entertained. Come, join us now. Good evening, and welcome to Hanging with Higgins. I'm your host, John J. Higgins. Tonight, I have a fellow authoress who has written a novelette with an interesting concept. It's called The Kiss of Death, which takes place in the 14th century in medieval London with the Bubonic Plague as its backdrop. An interesting time period I know little about, hence my interest in the topic. Sarah can be contacted through her website at www.sarahnatale.com. That's SARAHNATALE.com. She is also on Facebook at facebook.com/SarahNataleBooks and Twitter at SarahNatale_. Thanks for appearing, Sarah. How are you today?
I'm doing quite well. And yourself?
I'm fine, thank you. Nice to have you on.
Thank you so much for having me.
It's my pleasure. So why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Well, I'm a first-year student at Drake University in Des Moines, Iowa, working toward a double major in creative writing and public relations, and I really love it here. I'm working on 3 publications on campus currently, 2 magazines and a newspaper that I write for. My passion is obviously writing. My entire life I've known that I want to be a novelist and I want to work with writing and create my own stories and share them with the world. I also do a lot of reading, and I play tennis and do figure skating, and I'm also a classical pianist.
Wow, that's quite a combination for somebody. What, you were 19, 20?
I'm 18.
Wow, even more impressive. Somebody, have a goal like that and accomplished. At what point did you decide that you wanted to be a writer?
Well, ever since I was very little, I grew up with a lot of books around me all the time. My parents were very good about reading to me and making sure I had many reading materials. And I was always so fascinated by the plots in the books I was reading. And I thought, wow, I don't know how someone could come up with this. It must take a stroke of brilliance, because the people who write these 500-page novels or whatever it may be, it's a definite challenge, and I looked up to them, and I definitely have author role models, and I knew it was something that I wanted to be a part of, and so I've been writing since I could hold a pencil.
Wow. Well, so why don't you tell us about some of the authors that triggered your interest in writing? Okay,
well, one of my favorites when I was growing up was the Sweet Valley Twins series, created by Francine Pascal. And there's a whole Sweet Valley world built around that. There's several spin-off series. I think the original was Sweet Valley High, and my favorite one was Sweet Valley Twins, and so on. And another one, I'm more into my favorite author right now and in high school is Rochelle Mead, and she is the author of the Vampire Academy series and Bloodline spin-off series. And I am just so fascinated by her writing because she takes a topic that has been very saturated, the vampire world, but she makes it unique and puts her own unique spin on it. And I just think her plot and her writing style it's very well written and intriguing. And she's someone that I would look up to and want to be like.
And when I was young, we used to clean houses out, and there was a series that was much older than what I was. It was Thomas Hardy or the Hardy Boys or something, which was probably in the late 1890s, 1910, 1920s, and I would read those, and it was kind of fascinating because there was like characters and the way they developed and, the different adventures they went on. Mm-hmm. But, in the same token, then I would be reading books by Dostoevsky or, Thomas Hardy or whatever, like Jude the Obscure. So it was quite a range of different things. So it sounds to me like you've had a range of readings as well.
Oh, definitely. I don't think there's a set genre that I read, because I definitely like a lot of different genres, such as romance, fantasy, paranormal, realistic fiction, and I've dabbled in quite a few fields, and just reading in general is a great, fun pastime.
Yeah, well, I think that for me at least, it puts me in a whole other world that, the mind's eye can be a much better theater than anything you see on film or on stage.
Oh, definitely.
And particularly you have a writer that can really do that for you.
Yeah, I think that when a writer can really make you feel a strong emotion from the book, whether they make you laugh or make you cry, that is a great feat to accomplish.
Right. And, not all authors are able to do that. I think that takes a certain level of skill and the ability to observe their surroundings and that sort of thing. And your writers, did you like writers that were, I don't know, like I've liked Anne Rice's series on the vampires because I thought that was ingenious when she came up with it, because nobody had really dealt with, vampires very well. It was the Dracula Bram Stoker version until she kind of came on the scene and did her writing. And I liked a lot of her ideas and storylines and that, but some of her descriptions became so flowery I really didn't care about what the wallpaper was like, if you know what I mean.
Oh, right. Mm-hmm.
So the writers you read, you have a preference in that kind of style, or?
I think that they can have a lot of good description, but there is a point where it gets to be too much, like you said, too much describing the wallpaper. But I think like the fantasy elements are really interesting when they really throw you into their own world that they created that doesn't necessarily exist. And also even with realistic fiction, if you can relate to their world, which is similar to your own and things like that.
Right. It's like J.K. Rowling which I didn't know that I'd be wanting to read Harry Potter at the time, but when I've read her storyline is so rich with so much going on and so much entwinement that when you read it, it's almost like my jaw would drop that she could get so much into such a little amount of space.
Yeah, I was fascinated as well with the Harry Potter series and how it gripped you and made you want to dive into her world and live in it and be a wizard and learn how to do these spells. And it was beautiful.
Right. So that's another type of writing. I haven't read her. I guess she has a detective series or started one with a detective or a lawyer. I haven't read that as of yet. I personally have tried to avoid a lot of that because I worked in it. And, I don't necessarily find going back into those worlds as being relaxing.
Right.
Because I'm trying to solve the crime. But, I don't know how she translates that kind of magical world into a realistic world.
Yeah, that would be interesting to see how her new books incorporate her style of writing, which is, of course, what's going to get people to want to read her other books, but also in this different world that's different from Harry Potter's magical realm.
So the other fascinating thing you just told me about yourself is being a classical pianist. How did that all come about?
Well, I've been playing for about 10 years now, and it was one of the hobbies I took up when I was younger. I've been playing through the years, and my favorite pieces to play are classical, like Beethoven, Mozart, and Bach. And I like them a lot more than playing modern songs, just because I like the flowy feel of the classical music. And I don't necessarily listen to it a lot, but I really love playing it.
Okay. Now, do you think that, because I really believe we have different channels in our mind that open up creativity, do you think that the musical end has helped you with your writing? Oh,
wow, that's a great question. I think that it definitely exercises the different parts of your mind, the right side and left side. And I think the more that you're using your mind, whether it's making music or doing writing, or even I've heard that piano is linked to math, and I'm not sure how that would work, but even just all the synapses working together, I think it definitely helps.
Yeah, well, it seems that music, science, and math have, I guess there's maybe a logical patterning or whatever that seem to be related in the function of the brain, as opposed to language and writing and that sort of thing. But I'm not so sure that those differences are as distinct as they make them out to be a lot of times. Because we really don't know how the brain works. They're still not there. We're looking at electronic, resonances or whatever when people are thinking about certain things, or when somebody has brain damage and how it affects what happens. But I'm not so sure that all of that is perfectly, separated with left brain, right brain, and whatever. And one of the reasons I really say that is that when I do my own writing and I get into like dialogue dialogue particularly, but even in descriptive writing in terms of, action or whatever, there seems to be a flow to it that almost has to be musical for it to work correctly.
Wow, yeah.
Have you ever noticed that?
Yeah, that's a great analogy. I know that when you really get into the thick of your writing and it flows through your fingers, your mind is working faster than your hands can keep up, and you just keep jumping to the next thought and the next thought. And I could definitely see a correlation between the two, because when you're playing piano and you know the song so well, it's almost as if you're on autopilot, and you still look at the sheet music for clues as to the next line where you're going, but you don't necessarily need the music to help you through, and you're just flowing along.
Right. Well, I've done some things so often that I call it stepping outside of myself. I produced a play for, 5 years. I went to 170 high school with these inner city high school kids. And my introduction, I was trying to scare the audience before the play, because the play it was anti-bias crime, and they used, the N-word and, chink and all kinds of, pejorative terms, because it had some shock value to it that you really needed. But you had to keep the audience afraid somewhat so they didn't get too rambunctious. And there'd be times I'd do the introduction. I'd done it so many times that I could just rattle it off, without thinking. And I'd be standing there doing that and going to myself, right now I could go and just walk off stage. It was like I was having a whole conversation with myself as I was doing whatever I was doing. Do you find that when you play music that the score that well?
Yeah, it's when your muscle memory is going on the keys, and then you're thinking about your day. What am I going to do tomorrow? What do I have planned for tonight? Things like that.
Yeah, that's interesting. That's one of the things that fascinates me about, us. And sometimes I think that the brain function we have is more tied to our soul than just biological.
Oh.
Because that seems to me that, it's almost like our person, who we really are, is behind what happens in our body, our thought processes and our emotions and everything else, and then we can choose which ones we're going to, pursue or not pursue, rather than being driven just by the biology. If that makes any sense?
Yeah, that's interesting, because I know the biology and the mental aspect are linked interchangeably, but that's a good point you brought up.
And I'd also have that happen to me in court sometimes. I'd be standing in front of a judge, talking and going through whatever it was, and I'd be going, oh boy, this is not the time to foul this up. Don't. Which it's just interesting to me. I'm kind of an observer, which I think all writers are. I assume you're pretty good at observing things.
Yes, I'm very detail oriented, I pick up on a lot of the details that people may not pay attention to, and
Okay.
often I like to focus on the little details that will affect things in a way different than the main picture, which you can just pick up on. And so in my writing style, I include a lot of description and things like that, because I am intrigued by the small things that will make a big difference.
Right. Sometimes it's a small thing that can sum up exactly what's going on all around you, that you don't need to go through a whole, litany of description. And I can't think of an example off the top of my head, but I've always admired writers when they're able to do that. It just succinctly, places the mood of the room by something that's happened within it.
Mm-hmm.
And going back to the rhythm of writing, I found that often if I'm trying to do something that's got a lot of tension in it, that quite often I will change the length of the sentences. So if something's going to happen quickly, the sentences become very short.
Oh yes, playing with structure and syntax is a beautiful way to go about creating the mood in your writing. Not just language choice, but the way that you're arranging the words. So
yes, and I think that's what makes it fun. The great thing about writing is that there's just so many things to pursue, and techniques that you can play with or develop, that I don't think it will ever become boring.
Right. Yeah, it's interesting that link you said between playing piano and writing, and that you have to pay attention to all these little things as you're going through, but your mind somehow processes it so it flows. And then in piano, where you've got to focus on your right hand and your left hand at the same time, and then you've got the pedal, and then you're turning pages and still carrying on a conversation in your head with yourself. So
right.
Yeah,
yes. It's good. So now when you picked your college, did you pick your college particularly because of they have a writing program?
The writing program was a huge draw for me, more specifically because Drake University is one of the few universities that allows you to major in writing and not just have a concentration. And
okay.
that was an important thing for me, because writing is my passion and it's my first major. And then also Drake makes it really easy for the double major that I wanted to do in public relations, because a lot of the classes overlap and the two go hand in hand together. And so
yeah, definitely.
that was a big draw.
Definitely. So now your major is actually in writing?
Yes, it is.
Okay. That's new from my day. I wound up having the minor in English. I wanted the minor in history. My bachelor's is in psych.
Oh.
But I went to Rutgers College, and they had these groupings of different subject matter that you had to take a major, a minor, and a mini, which I couldn't take history as a minor because it was in the same category of psychology, which they considered humanities. And then then I was stuck in either minoring in a science or I guess in language arts or whatever, which turned out to be English. And then my mini was actually in chemistry. I don't really understand what the push was for all of that, because I don't know that in my adult life that I really needed a lot of chemistry. But certainly have never needed calculus, and I even had that in high school. I should have taken typing.
Oh.
I still type with two fingers, but it's. But I think it's fascinating that they have a major just in writing. And now, in your writing courses, does that touch into journalism at all, or is that just like creative writing?
Well, creative writing is where my passion stems from. So that's with the writing major, but with my public relations major, in the J school, it's called the Journalism and Mass Communications School, we have to take a lot of journalism classes to prepare us for the public relations field, where we're writing news releases and keeping that communication with our clients and the general public. So I am definitely learning a lot about how to be a journalist as well. And since I'm writing for publications on campus, including the school newspaper and magazine, I need to balance the two types of writing. And I find it's a challenging thing to do because you have to switch off the different types of writing in your mind that okay, I'm writing for journalism now. It's a different structure than my flowy creative writing that makes me so excited. So it's a challenge.
Yes. Well, journalistic writing is always pretty much getting right to the point, and what you get maybe 300 words for an article.
And yeah, every word counts, and you have to be really short and succinct. Whereas writing, you could go on, write a 500-page book, 600-page book, whatever you so choose. So
right,
it's
exactly.
Definitely, it's hard to be short and succinct, but also hard to expand yourself into a full-length novel as well. So you get to learn both skills, which is a great thing to do.
Yes, and it is all related. It's like you say, it's technique and methodology, and what the end product really needs to be. Have you done much of the journalistic writing? Because I know you say you're on a couple of school publications.
Yes, just this year I started writing for those. I worked on my school newspaper in high school, and I was editor-in-chief, but I'm doing a lot more with the journalism aspect in college, I'm finding. And I welcome it because I know it'll make me a more well-rounded and ultimately better writer.
Right. And the journalistic stuff is definitely related to the PR stuff. I worked, my career was pretty much in government, and I was personal staff to attorney generals and that kind of thing. So, I dealt with, many press releases depending on the topic and that sort of thing. As a prosecutor, I basically avoided the press because judges certainly frowned upon the prosecutor discussing the case in front of the press. Defense attorneys do it all the time, but we were very restricted. But that skill set is really important in terms of knowing what a reporter or a newspaper or a magazine wants to know from a spokesperson's perspective and contained in a press release. Do you have any political aspirations that way?
Mostly, not per se. I would say mostly I'm focusing on writing for myself and representing clients in PR, not so much the political aspect.
Okay. Well, I just figured I'd ask because it's, many people go into PR. That's what they end up with. I have another gentleman that I interviewed that maybe you'd like to listen to him at some point, named Tim Sullivan. He was the editor of the Rutgers paper. He wound up working for Senator Bradley. He was our U.S. Senator back in those days. And then he was doing PR for many different people. He worked with Paul McCartney's wife Heather Mills with her foundation, and eventually he became the PR person for Dr. Oz. So he's now working for Oz in New York. So he's had an interesting career. Yes, very much so. So I figured I'd just let you know that since we're talking. So the other thing that's kind of fascinating about...
Yeah, thank you. Go ahead.
Are you there? Okay. One of the things that really fascinated me about you particularly was this novelette that you've been writing, because that cannot be an easy time period to write about. What drew you to 14th century medieval England?
Well, it was precisely the idea of the challenge that thrilled me and intrigued me about this topic. And it was actually an assignment in my senior creative writing class where we had to write what was called a docudrama. And it had to be a historical fiction. That was a requirement. And so we entered the school year knowing that this is going to be our final semester project. And so all through the school year I was thinking about, okay, what is a topic I could do that I would be passionate about, that I would want to write a full story about? And you had to get the topic approved by him, and he was very specific. It couldn't be too general. It had to be a certain period, but it had to be a period of time that was well known and not too obscure. And I know everyone knows about, the Black Plague, and you can make jokes like, I'll avoid that like the plague because it goes back to that time period, but not so many people know the details behind it. And that was what got me interested, because I thought it was really interesting how a biological disease like that could wipe out 1/3 of Europe's population, and I wanted to learn more about that and what it entailed, and ultimately base a story around it. And so my teacher approved the topic, which made me ecstatic, and I began my research, learning more about it. I think part of my inspiration for that particular time period was back in grade school when I did a book report on a historical fiction of a different time of I think it was the 1500s or 1600s outbreak of plague. And my teacher said, well, are you going to talk about that era? And I actually chose the 1300s because it was the first big outbreak of plague, but there is not so much information known about it, so I thought it would be a lot of fun to go digging through history, and history is something that is just interesting to me in general. So then to create a cast of characters and a slight hint of romance in there as well, and throw them into this raging world was a really fun thing to do.
Well, I didn't realize there were two different waves of it. So why don't you talk about that a little bit? Was the initial wave transmitted with the fleas on the rats, or was that different?
Well, you're correct. It was transmitted through the fleas and rats, and the first major wave was in 1348, it went from the Far East in through Italy and into Europe, and then eventually got to London, where my story takes place. And all throughout history there are many outbreaks of plagues, but the big two are the one in 1348 and the one a couple hundred years later. And there were outbreaks in between both of those and even after. And I know the plague still exists in the world today, which is kind of scary if you think about it, but it's dormant. It's not going to be hitting anytime soon. But it's just something that has plagued history.
Right. No pun intended, right?
So.
Now, this is both
right,
waves.
Yeah, I was just thinking that.
Both waves were the Bubonic Plague.
Yes. When I did a lot of research, specifically pertaining to the 14th century, the biggest one that everyone knows about is the Bubonic Plague, because the term came from the fact that there were actual boo-boos on the skin that was a part of the disease that really showed it. And there was actually 3 strains. There was a one that transmitted through the air, through coughing and sneezing, and there was also one that could infect you straight through the blood and through the stomach, which was a lot less known. But the reason that scientists believe that it spread so fast was because of the one that spread through the air and infected people who were in close quarters with them from person to person. So after the fleas and the rats brought it in, then it started being spread through person to person.
Right, like a common cold then.
Yeah, only a lot more devastating.
Right. So, what basically was the symptomology? I know you said the boo-boos, but what happens, to the body in that? I know they called it the Black Death. I assume that it was almost like gangrene, but it's an area I don't know. Right.
So the boo-boos that would form on the body were these pustules, and I don't want to be too graphic, but it was called the Black Death, I think, because it would turn black and it would be really hard and painful for the victims. And they had a myriad of symptoms. I know there was a lot of high fevers and not being able to keep their food down, and no coughing and sneezing, and they were bedridden often, and it would spread through the doctors too that would try to tend to them, depending on what type of the plague. The bubonic one wasn't spread as easily, and I think it was also easily recovered from because it involved direct touch to spread. But I think the combination of all three of them was what really triggered that.
Well, now in the plague that went through in 1348 was where I've seen the pictures, which of course I laugh at today, but where the doctors would walk around with like a bird beak kind of mask. I think they determined, right, that birds weren't getting it, so they thought it had something to do with the shape of the beak or something. Well, was that in that time period, or was that the later one?
It occurred a lot in the later one, but I think there was some instances in the first one. And it's funny you mentioned the bird mask, because that actually was the thing that they would wear, and I did a lot of the research behind it, and it seemed that they thought they could ward it off by covering themselves, and which was actually really smart, because a lot of the things they did back then, like they put a taboo on bathing because they thought that spread the disease, which was obviously the worst thing they could do, but they were actually right about keeping their air cleaner by keeping a mask over their faces, and they would put a lot of smelling salts and things like different scents and herbs and things like that, and they would carry them around or put them in the mask to ward off the disease. And some of it did have a lot of merit, and I described in the book the main character, Elizabeth, is actually very terrified of the physician when he comes into their house to tend to her little brother who has the disease, because she's just this grotesque mask the physician is wearing, and he smells really bad because he's wearing all these scents to keep the plague away. But it was terrifying for them, but it did serve a purpose.
Right. Now you would think that, someplace along the line they would stumble on something that may kill the... Well, now, was the plague viral or was it bacterial?
It was a bacteria. I don't recall the technical phrase for it.
Right.
But yeah, I believe it was bacteria that spread.
If you had something that acted as an antibiotic then, right? Because I don't know that we have anything antiviral, right? Maybe Thermoflu, but I think that's really just almost like an immunization type thing, right? Well, regardless, it would seem to me that you probably could find something that would be antibiotic. I mean, that whole discovery of antibiotics is kind of funny to begin with the moldy bread in the Petri dish that they stumbled upon. But so that seems pretty fascinating. Now, in your novelette, did you go into the some of the practices of hygiene back in those days? Because that was pretty gross to put it lightly. Because they really didn't have sewers and that stuff then, did they? In London?
No, they didn't. They just would dump their waste into the streets, which made the problem worse. And a lot of the streets weren't paved, and so you've got all this dirt that's privy to the elements, to the horses and carriages that would go through, and all the human waste there too. And like I said, they strongly advised against bathing because they thought that it was a bad thing to do. And a lot of times it was hard for the peasants and the poorer people or even the middle class to bathe a lot, because it required heating the water, and the nobility would, and I talked about this in the book, the nobility would hire their servants to heat the water for them and things like that. But one thing I did find that they did well was they advocated washing up your hands and face before eating meals, so that was a good thing that they did. But as far as keeping themselves clean was not a huge concern for them.
Right. Well, they didn't even have running water at that stage, did they? I mean, the Romans at least had the aqueducts and all of that, where they had developed, they were much further advanced than what it was in the Middle Ages. That had been lost, I guess, for almost 1,000 years then. But, if you wanted water, you had to carry it back to your house, right?
Yeah, and they had basins that they would wash themselves in, but there was no direct, clean flowing water per se.
Right, which also, that adds. If you think back on it, it's amazing that there weren't many more diseases with that level of lack of hygiene.
Yeah, it's amazing that so many people did survive because of the ubiquity of diseases back then and how easily they spread from person to person and took out whole cities. So
right. Well, I mean the whole problem with hygiene, came almost up until the 20th century when one thinks about it. I've studied a lot about the Civil War and that sort of thing, and many of the soldiers died because of getting dysentery and I guess typhoid because of the lack of proper sanitation. Some of the generals would have the soldiers going to the bathroom or whatever, the latrines, upriver, so then the water would flow down, and that's where they would get their drinking water from, which was absolutely insane too.
Wow, it's horrible, yeah.
Yeah. So why don't you tell us now in your book, because you have, I guess, do you deal with the issue of the royalty as opposed to the lower class, or are your characters all in one class or another?
So the main character, Elizabeth Chauncey, grows up in a wealthy household, and she has a distant relation to nobility, but she refuses to consider herself that way. She would rather be peasantry, and this is one of the many battles she deals with throughout the story of the class issue. And her love interest, Matthias de Burgeville, he is a working class. I would say probably would be considered, the working middle class, and he works for her father's craftsman shop. And one of the things that was unique that I made the story with was that the noble household, usually they don't do work like craftsmanship, but the father did that, and you could say that he didn't want anything to do with the nobility either, because of the fact that he wanted to create his own wealth. He wanted to keep making a living doing hands-on work and not relying on, class to give him what he needed to survive. And so Elizabeth sees that, and she often role models that and wants to be more of a peasant girl, I guess you could argue, and she actually eventually gets her wish when, she has to escape her house when it's boarded up because one of the people in it has the disease, and so that brings into issues of ethics as well, because they would keep everyone inside the house and no one was allowed to escape, and the disease would spread through the entire family, and so she knew she had to escape, and when she does, she finds herself living in peasantry and finds that, she was prepared for it because of the way she viewed her life and knew that nobility isn't everything, and being wealthy doesn't mean that you're any more immune to this disease than anyone else, because it affected everyone in the same way.
Right.
And so that was one thing that, with her love interest, that was sort of keeping them apart, because of the fact that they knew that they wouldn't be able to get married because of the fact that he was a working classman and he would need to have a significant amount of money saved up before they could do that. And so that there's many different plot lines going on of different problems that arise in the story.
Right, because that's pretty sophisticated to be able to deal with the class differences at the time, and even the occupations that someone would have. anything in particular you read that led you into that level of research? I mean, that is very sophisticated.
When I was creating my main character, the first thing I was thinking was, okay, what type of person is she going to be? What are her hopes and desires? What does she value? And this is a book about values in a way, because you've got, you know, the disease and the religious aspect, and then the class aspect, and valuing wealth or not. And so I thought, well, I don't want to make her a peasant girl, but I don't want to make her a snobby, wealthy girl either. So I kind of created this middle realm where she lives like nobility, but she doesn't necessarily want that for herself. And with the father being a working man, that's not something you see very often either. So for her to be nobility yet still respecting hard work and labor and what that can do for you as far as your mindset toward life.
Right. And even the emerging middle class, because that's just around the time that the middle class starts to come into its own. Right before that, it was pretty much servitude to the royals, whatever level they may have been. Right, the serfs were allowed to live on the manor of the lord, and I guess the lord took care of them to some degree in exchange for their labor. The whole craftsmen, you know, were people who were, you know, doing specific kind of jobs like that, wheelwrights and I guess blacksmiths and that sort of thing were just emerging. So again, I think that's pretty sophisticated, you know, for you to have come up with.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah, it's quite fascinating, because that really is a transition time period when one thinks about it.
Oh, definitely, yes.
So now is this a lot of your values that you use through these characters, conscious or unconscious?
Well, I suppose, you know, you could say that when an author creates her main character, a lot of your own self is shown through that character. And one of the things I wanted to do with Elizabeth was have her battle with her own values and what she thinks is important in life. And so that's why I had the religious aspect where it causes divisions between her and her love interest, Matthias, because they're starting to realize one of the things that I researched extensively in this story was that, you know, religion was a huge problem for these people, because they thought, well, why would God cause this type of pain onto a city? Why wasn't he helping them? And they even closed churches and things like that because of the spread of disease. And so she's trying to work out what she believes, and at the same time, Matthias is having issues keeping up with her because he's just, the plague has disillusioned him and he doesn't even know where he's going anymore. And then on top of that, there's the class divisions. And so Elizabeth is trying to figure out what she values, and eventually whether or not Matthias will come full circle with her and to the point where she decides what she's going to do is a huge conflict for them. Right.
And that makes a lot of sense, because somebody in that position would be trying to understand, you know. I don't think they had a great understanding on how the world worked back then anyway. And most of that was from, you know, I guess it was basically Catholicism still in that century, that they were, you know, trusting that, you know, God had their back or whatever, and the religious leaders, of course, were the pipeline to God himself, and you know, they should be able to do something. And of course, it was, you know, it was a medical issue and not just a spiritual issue. So that of course, and again, that's very sophisticated. That's why I was fascinated with the time period you were writing with, because it's not an easy time period to deal with. You know, some time periods seem much simpler. That one with the plague going through just really rocked the entire structure at the time.
Right. Yeah, and the fact that I could go so many different ways with it, because not so much is known, and I wanted to find out more, for me to know and then to incorporate in my story and show others, these are all the things they were dealing with at that time, and it's remarkable that people were able to make their lives during that time and carry on.
Yes, absolutely. And then, of course, you have all the class struggles going on. So even, trying to survive. I mean, back in those days, I guess when you'd have a major catastrophe like a plague going through, it really must have affected even how you acquired food and, just basic survival stuff, because I don't know that, the normal, if you want to call it transportation, abilities of moving food around and whatever would be, hindered. Particularly if you were living in a city, because you're not growing the crop in the street.
Yeah, and it's often easy at that time for your food systems to be contaminated by the rats that ran rampant through the cities, and then and nobody would even know that was happening, and so they wouldn't even understand why the disease broke out. So that was a big factor as well.
When I was in college, I had a history course. It was a psychohistory course. Probably the only, that was the wave where they started to look at historical figures psychologically, which also fascinated me because, I believe that everybody does whatever they do for some kind of reason that's, within their psyche. Mm-hmm. And the professor I had, he had come up with the theory of, I guess, Saint Teresa, that she was having all these visions, and his theory was that she was having these visions because she was starving herself and she was suffering from anorexia nervosa, which was kind of an interesting concept when you think back on it. And of course, around that time, I don't want to say around that time, but there was also a theory that there were bacterial growths on the grain or whatever that would cause hallucinogenic effects on people.
Oh, wow.
Which is also a very fascinating kind of explanation rather than just the spiritual, which, I kind of believe in spiritual, so I think that certainly could happen. But it's always fascinating to me to see how people try to explain, what was going on in a particular time period in history.
Oh, yeah, the stories that people will come up with back in olden times to explain things is definitely fascinating. But one of the things that I researched and mentioned in the book was that they created this whole story to describe how the disease came about, and they said there was a giant disease-infested cloud that was passing over the ocean in the Far East, which was where the plague originated. And they said that because there was a dissonance between the ocean and the sun, or some elemental thing like that, it was angry and it was causing all the suffering, which was it's intriguing to see what they would come up with to explain things.
Right, and it would make sense from their observations because as time went on, it spread from east to west, mm-hmm. and it either did it by ground or by air. So, that certainly made a lot of sense. Although it may be wrong.
Right.
It is fascinating. So now I want to get into a little bit about your actual writing. So how did there's this two schools of thought that, there's the plotters who outline everything, and then there's the people who write by the seat of their pants. They just sit down and write. So are you in one school or the other, or a little bit of both?
Well, initially, all of my first works were written as a pantser, by the seat of my pants, coming up with a story as I go along from one idea that I'd had that was my inspiration. And what's different about The Kiss of Death was that since it was a school assignment, we were required to write an outline and say specifically what was going to happen at what point and plot out the entire thing. And that was really difficult for me because I had never worked with outlines and I saw them as more of a hindrance. But I was actually really thankful to my creative writing teacher for assigning that, because it actually really helped me to know where I was going with the story. And this was one of the first times I'd actually really sat down and planned it out. And of course, I left holes in the story where I wasn't exactly sure what was going to happen at what point, and I wrote the ending, and then I had 3 alternate lead-ins to the ending that I left there until I got to the end of the story, and then I chose one. And by that time, the story dictated which one I would choose. So it was, for the most part, laid out, and I found that was really satisfying to know, okay, this is where I'm going next, now I'm going to write this scene, and then craft the scene around the notes and the outline I'd made to myself.
Yes, that's one of the things that always intrigues me is how we write, the mechanics of it, and get from point A to point B. I've got 9 books in the series I'm writing with this Archangel Jeremiel, and I've got the 4th book is with the publisher, but I have the other books. I can't tell you every detail in the other 5, but I can tell you where each one ends. So that gives me some kind of structure to aim for. And I really like what you just said about having 3 different alternate ways of getting to that point, and then the story kind of dictated where you ended up.
Mm-hmm.
For me, once I fully have fleshed out the character in my head, but let me just put this as a caveat, is that I'm not the kind that really wants the full history of, what kind of ice cream they like. Mm-hmm. I think that you don't need that level of detail when you're writing a character. But once I have a sense of who that character really is, and that character, to me, develops its own voice, then they kind of dictate what their dialogue is and how they react to a situation, and fill in the gaps as I write.
Oh, definitely, I agree with that, and I think the more the character develops, they sort of come through in their dialogue.
Yes, and the character will act in a certain way that, despite what you think the character may do, the character can tell you what it's going to do. And say, no, that's not what I would do. I'm going to the left here. I don't care what you think. And I really love those moments. Those are like the gems that come about from writing.
Yeah, where your character is sort of driving you instead of the other way around.
Yes. And I've had some people say, oh, I know which character you are in the book. And I'm going, I just kind of laugh, because it's like, I'm all of them.
Right, yeah.
It's not like I have a committee that comes into my house and start saying, well, I'm so-and-so, and this is what we're doing. It all comes from within.
Mm-hmm.
And, I just find that to be fascinating. I also have come to the thought that, even the pantsers, as you phrase them,
mm-hmm.
I think they have a sense of where they're going. They just don't articulate it. And because I don't think you can just write a scene without having a sense of where the other scenes are coming from or going. Do you?
And mostly all of the other things I've written, I did pantser work, and you do have a general idea of where you're going, but you only have the general idea out to a certain point, and after that, it's just you
murky.
Don't know. It's just a cloud of, well, what's going to happen next, and that's, I guess, the scary part about being a pantser. But at the same time, you're not limited, and so that can be interesting, because when you write up to that point where you don't know where to go next, oftentimes the veil will be released, and it'll be clearer to you until you get to the next scene, and then you have that same aspect again, which makes it an interesting way to write. And then sometimes you'll get to the point where you can't think of anything next, so you need to put it aside and think about it a bit more. So it's right. The 2 schools of thought. There's definitely merits to both of them, I think.
Right. I don't think that... Well, I guess when I wrote legal briefs, I was pretty much more of an outliner, kind of, because I had to react to whatever it was, or even if it was a motion I was filing. There's a certain there's a certain set of arguments that you have to present. It doesn't matter. It won't be legally sufficient if you don't. So your creativity is extremely limited. And in research, when you do it, you'll find cites to a case and a holding by the court or whatever that you need to rely on and build your argument around. So you don't get to be, murky and creative in that sense. But, in anything else, I think you have a little bit of leeway in that. And there have been times that when I've written, I went, I don't like this path at all. And I'll go back to the decision point, the crossroads, and go, I'm not going down that road now. Let's try the other road. And sometimes I've written like alternate stories that way, and I said, this one's better than that one. So, you're working on another book, right?
Yes, I'm always working on the new project, the next project, and I'm actually working on. I'm in different stages of several different projects right now. I have a couple other full-length novels that I've written that I'm at different stages with, and I have some other ideas in my mind for stories or for books that I haven't written yet that I'm still playing with, and I have my detailed lists and folders of all my ideas and things. But I'm always writing. I have to take a break for my schoolwork, but as soon as I have a significant amount of time to sit down and write for me, then I'll be working on that.
Right. I had met a guy who was published many years ago. He was a detective, actually, up in Toronto, and he had said to me, when he was writing one book, he was working on 3 others at the same time. I think it just comes with the territory. Once you open up the creative vein, that you get a flood of different ideas, and as you're working on something, you go, oh, that would be a good story, or somebody says something to you and you jot it down. You go, oh, you know what, that'd be a great story as well. And I know I've got like 4 or 5 things started myself. Some up to 100 pages, others 50 or 60, some 10. And then at some point I will go back and concentrate on what that storyline is and go to the to the finishing point with it.
Right, you sort of flip back and forth. Like maybe for this month you're working on the stage of this novel, and then on a different month you're working on starting something else or editing something you've already written, and you just sort of cycle along so that you don't get bored with what you're working on, because you're always thinking of what's the next thing, where am I going next, and exercising your creative mind.
Right, and sometimes, like you said, you get stuck. You don't know where to go next, and then you've got to me, I call it simmering. I just let it simmer. Yeah. And then 3 o'clock in the morning, you have a dream or something, or you'll wake up, or you'll be in the shower, and you'll go, oh.
Oh, boy.
Now I know.
I can't tell you how many times when I'm right in the thick of things in writing, and I say, okay, it's time to go to sleep, but I try to go to sleep, and for the next hour I keep getting up and scribbling down a note on a notepad, and then trying to sleep again, going, wait, no, I have another idea, and having to write that down too. Because it just, the characters are screaming at you to be written. They want to be written.
Absolutely. So now, when is your book coming out, your novelette?
It's through Kellen Publishing, small publisher, later this year. I don't have a set date yet, because right now I am working on the artwork cover design that my artist is working on. So as soon as we get that, then I'll have a more set date.
All right, well, you let me know, because I'll publicize it through any of my sites. So I wanted to give you an opportunity to tell people how to get in touch with you. Could you run through that for us?
Sure. You can reach me on my website and on social media. My website is www.sarahnatale.com, SARAHNATALE.com. And I can also be reached on Facebook, facebook.com/SarahNataleBooks, and Twitter @SarahNatale_.
Great, Sarah. I've really enjoyed talking to you. If you hold on a second, I'll be back to you in a minute. For those listening, I want to say thanks to our-truth.com, and you can find out more information about me and my book series, The Archangel Jeremiel and the War to Conquer Heaven, at www.john-j-higgins.com, and the website for this radio show, which is at www.hangingwithhiggins.com. And with that, I will say good night.